All right, welcome everybody. You've come to Propaganda, what it is, where it comes from, and what to expect this election. My name is Rich Procida. I'm an author, attorney, and journalist. I write for laprogressive.com, and I produce a podcast called Bible Study for Progressives. I've been writing a series of articles and doing a series of podcasts on propaganda because I believed the National Security Agency reports that said we would be hit with propaganda from sources both foreign and domestic this election. Educating ourselves about propaganda and other deceptive and coercive means of manipulation and abuse is important not only to protect ourselves, but to protect our families, our communities, and our nation as well. We also have with us Lisa Snow. Lisa is a media psychology specialist and the author of Mind Media Madness, Alt Facts, Fake News, Russian Hacking, and What's Next. She was also media psychology consultant for the documentary, The Brainwashing of My Dad. Lisa will be monitoring the questions in the chat. She will comment and help me answer your questions. Also helping is Rhett Kuczynski, who will be monitoring the chat and helping with technical issues. So feel free to put your answers to any questions that I ask in the chat, share and comment. Please be nice and polite and use the question and answer button if you have questions. That would make Lisa's job a lot easier. Okay, so let's begin. In this time of partisan media and foreign interference, it is important to be aware of propaganda and its effect on us. We are inundated with propaganda, and we are all subject to its influence. So I want to provide you with basic information about propaganda, what it is, the various types of propaganda, how it works, and what we can do to become better consumers of news and information. I'm frustrated with all the divisiveness, both the conflict between the right and the left, and the factionalism within the left itself. We see this in the struggle between the progressive wing and the establishment wing of the Democratic Party. There are also divisions within the left along the lines of race, religion, and ideology, among other things. There is Democratic Party and Republican Party propaganda, establishment propaganda, third-party propaganda, and propaganda where the source is hidden or unknown. I've come to believe that one reason we are so divided and fractured is because of the influence of propaganda and disinformation. Propaganda has been around since ancient times. Every election year, we hear the same arguments and appeals from political parties and candidates designed to manipulate us in one way or another. Even our own leaders are lying and manipulating us. So I decided to research propaganda, cults, covert hypnosis, and I encourage all of you to research these and other mind control techniques on your own in order to protect ourselves from manipulative people and organizations. I also recommend that everyone learn about narcissism and other personality disorders in order to protect ourselves from abusive relationships and manipulative people. At the same time, we should also learn about what a healthy personality looks like. By educating ourselves, we can overcome some of the adverse impacts of propaganda and disinformation and defend ourselves against manipulative people, groups, and organizations. Having said that, I've decided not to reinvent the wheel. We will begin with a video introduction. I have some slides and other videos to share, and we'll take questions along the way, and we'll conclude with a short exercise and discussion. So,
the American historian Howard Zinn wrote, "If those in charge of our society, politicians, corporate executives, and owners of press and television, can dominate our ideas, they will be secure in their power. They will not need soldiers patrolling the streets. we will control ourselves. In this day and age, we are exposed to enormous amounts of propaganda, some of which is used for the purpose of manipulating us into thinking and acting in ways which only further the interests of small minorities. The purpose of this lecture is to examine propaganda and communicate information which will hopefully enable individuals to arm themselves against the dangerous effects of propaganda. It should be noted that we will draw largely from the classic work by Jacques Ellul, Propaganda, the Formation of Men's Attitudes. Propaganda can be defined as a type of persuasion tactic which displays three general characteristics. Firstly, propaganda is deliberately made by an individual or group of individuals, called the propagandist, for the purpose of manipulating individuals into adopting certain ideas and behaviors. Secondly, propaganda never presents an issue in a clear and unbiased manner. Instead, propaganda attempts to present one side of an issue as if it were an absolute truth. Adolf Hitler, who with the help of his propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels implemented one of the most massive propaganda campaigns of the 20th century, captured this characteristic with these words: "The function of propaganda is not to make an objective study of the truth and then set it before the masses with academic fairness. Its task is to serve our own right, always and unflinchingly." Finally, propaganda tends to use psychological manipulation tactics and to play on the emotions and prejudices of individuals so as to convince them that the idea, action, or attitude they adopted was one they chose through their own personal volition. This last feature of propaganda is what can make it especially dangerous. Jacques Ellul provided a chilling description of the individual whose personality has been thoroughly molded by propaganda. When he recites his propaganda lesson and says that he is thinking for himself, when his eyes see nothing and his mouth only produces sounds previously stenciled into his brain, when he says that he is indeed expressing his judgment, then he really demonstrates that he no longer thinks at all, ever, and that he does not exist as a person. It should be noted that as a persuasion tactic, propaganda is value neutral, or in other words, neither good nor bad. The 20th century propaganda theorist Howard Laswell wrote that propaganda as a tool is no more moral or immoral than a pump handle. While propaganda is merely a tool, moral judgments can be made regarding the ends for which propaganda is used, and it is because propaganda has so often been used for nefarious purposes that today it is widely considered as evil in and of itself. Propaganda, according to Philip Taylor, author of Munitions of the Mind, can be distinguished from education in that while propaganda tells people what to think, education teaches people how to think. However, as educational systems have long been used as vehicles to disseminate propaganda, the distinction between education and propaganda is often blurry. As a persuasion tactic, propaganda in one form or another has been used for virtually the entire course of human history. Yet the word propaganda was first used in 1622. In that year, Pope Gregory XV established the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. The main function of the congregation was to defend the doctrines of Catholicism against challenges arising from the Protestant Reformation. The early 20th century is usually identified as an important turning point in the history of propaganda, as it was during this period that so-called modern propaganda emerged. What differentiates modern propaganda from all earlier forms of propaganda is the use of mass media, such as radio and television, as a medium to disseminate propaganda. Britain and the United States were the first countries to utilize mass media in this manner, and thus the countries where modern propaganda originated. The utilization of mass media allowed propagandists to reach audiences on a scale never before imagined. The American George Creel, author of the book How We Advertised America, is considered one of the forefathers of modern propaganda. Creel was a friend of Woodrow Wilson, who was the president during America's entry into World War I. Wilson called on George Creel to organize a committee which came to be known as the Committee on Public Information, or the Creel Commission, whose purpose was to create propaganda in order to transform the attitude of the American population into one of war-hungry patriotic excitement. As Noam Chomsky explained, such a propaganda campaign was highly successful. The Creel Commission succeeded within 6 months in turning a pacifist population into a hysterical warmongering population which wanted to destroy everything German, tear the Germans limb from limb, go to war and save the world. Britain also made extensive use of propaganda during World War I, and Hitler, who once famously stated, "Propaganda, propaganda, propaganda, all that matters is propaganda," was intrigued by the success of the Allied war propaganda. Explaining the effect such propaganda had on him, Hitler wrote, "But it was not until the war that it became evident what immense results can be obtained by a correct application of propaganda. Here again, unfortunately, all our study had to be done on the enemy side, for the activity on our side was modest, to say the least. For what we failed to do, the enemy did with amazing skill and really brilliant calculation. I myself learned enormously from this enemy war propaganda." One of the most prevalent types of propaganda, and the type which will concern us for the remainder of the lecture, is political propaganda. Political propaganda is propaganda used by a government, state, or political party for the purpose of altering the ideas and behavior of individuals in order to achieve certain political or economic ends. All political propaganda is vertical propaganda, in the sense that it is made by a propagandist who creates and implements propaganda while standing over and above the ignorant population. Classic propaganda, as one usually thinks of it, is a vertical propaganda, in the sense that it is made by a leader, a technician, a political or religious head who acts from the superior position of his authority and seeks to influence the crowd below. Such propaganda comes from above. It is conceived in the secret recesses of political enclaves. It uses all technical methods of centralized mass communication. It envelops a mass of individuals, but those who practice it are on the outside. People often assume that political propaganda mainly consists of lies, fabrications, and extreme distortions of reality. Hitler is famous for claiming the bigger the lie, the more likely it will be believed, while Arthur Ponsonby, the author of the book Falsehood in Wartime, once wrote, "When war is declared, truth is the first victim." Yet, as Hulot pointed out, although political propaganda sometimes consists of big lies, modern political propagandists more often than not are committed to the use of true facts. In other words, true facts are chosen and presented to the public, yet only for the purpose of supporting and substantiating false and distorted interpretations of events. The reasoning behind this tactic is that if one questions the interpretation put forth by the propagandist can provide evidence that the facts they presented were true, and therefore fool the public into thinking that their interpretations must also be true. Propaganda is necessarily false when it interprets and colors facts and imputes meaning to them. It is true when it serves up the plain fact, but does so only for the sake of establishing a pretense and only as an example of the interpretation that it supports with that fact. Another common misconception about political propaganda is the belief that the masses would be better off without it. While such a view seems fairly sensible, Hulot thoroughly disagreed with it. Rather, Hulot believed that political propaganda imposes meaning and intelligibility on the often chaotic course of world events. While individuals of centuries past would often look to the church to provide such explanations, now more often than not, people look to politicians. And it is political propagandists who impose order and coherence on history through the creation of stories which place the state in an almost deified position. Propaganda eliminates anxieties stemming from irrational and disproportionate fears, for it gives man assurances equivalent to those formerly given him by religion. It offers him a simple and clear explanation of the world in which he lives, to be sure, a false explanation far removed from reality, but one that is obvious and satisfying. It hands him a key with which he can open all doors. There is no more mystery. Everything can be explained thanks to propaganda. It gives him special glasses through which he can look at present-day history and clearly understand what it means. It hands him a guideline with which he can recover the general line running through all incoherent events. Now the world ceases to be hostile and menacing. To conclude this lecture, we will consider the role of propaganda in modern-day democracies. A democracy is based on the notion that the voting population has influence on the policies which a government implements. However, Hulot proposed that modern propaganda has given democratic governments the power to desecrate the democratic process by increasingly deciding on policies independent of the voting population. After policies have been created by those in positions of power, propaganda is then used to shape public opinion and manipulate the voting population into desiring exactly what the government has already decided to do. The point is to make the masses demand of the government what the government has already decided to do. If it follows this procedure, the government can no longer be called authoritarian, because the will of the people demands what is being done. As Elul warned, when a democratic government uses propaganda to convince the masses to want what it has already decided to do, in reality a democracy no longer exists. Once democracy becomes the object of propaganda, it also becomes as totalitarian, authoritarian, and exclusive as dictatorship. With his critique of modern democracy, Elul was in no way attacking it solely for the sake of discrediting it. Nor, in his analysis of propaganda, was he belittling the modern individual who he thought to be a willing victim of propaganda. On the contrary, as he explains in the following passage, Elul thought that to warn one of the dangers which propaganda poses, both to society and the individual, is of the greatest service to mankind. For it is only when a danger is recognized as a danger that mankind can fight against it. To warn a political system of the menace hanging over it does not imply an attack against it, but is the greatest service one can render the system. The same goes for man. To warn him of his weakness is not to attempt to destroy him, but rather to encourage him to strengthen himself. I insist that to give such a warning is an act in the defense of man, that I am not judging propaganda with Olympian detachment, and that having suffered, felt, and analyzed the impact of the power of propaganda on myself, I want to speak of it as a menace which threatens the total personality.
So, what do you think it means by saying that propaganda is a threat to the total personality? If you want to enter some of your answers in the chat box. If the propagandist can influence our thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors, he can take over our being and who we are. As he said, people don't think when they are under the influence of propaganda, ever, because everything they think has been instilled in them by the propagandist. Propaganda not only influences our mind, it also affects our attitudes and behaviors, ideas and technology, ideas and ideology like theology can be used as tools to manipulate us. If the propagandist can influence our attitudes and behaviors, he can influence our relationships as well. And on a side note, I would just like to say this is so important and this is often missed because we take what we think for granted. We don't think about the influences that we might be under. And the mind, everything starts in the mind. Everything starts in the mind. From the very small things we do every day to things as massive as genocide and even war. So until people have been convinced that genocide or the war is necessary, it's appropriate. In fact, it has to be done, and that risking their own lives is necessary too. People won't just go to war for the heck of it. People just won't start committing a genocide for the heck of it. They have to be convinced first. That starts in the mind. So everything starts in the mind first, even wars and genocides, before the first person is killed, before the first bomb is dropped or bullet is fired. So it's really, really critically important that we understand these influences, understand the importance of propaganda, and really focus in on our own thinking and how we're coming to the conclusions we are. Are you ready, Rich?
Yep, I'm ready. Did we get any questions in the questions yet? No? Okay.
We have people blindly believe the mainstream media's reporting of the news, forgetting that it is less than 6 for-profit transnational corporations saying the same repetitive, hypnotic messaging.
Okay, very good. So propaganda is simply any publicly disseminated persuasive material. The word propaganda has taken on a negative connotation as deceptive and extreme, but propagandists also use true facts and persuasive ideas to manipulate us. They appeal to our emotions to override our critical mind and give us just enough information to lead us to the wrong conclusion. We need to move beyond the truth or falsity of a claim because we can rarely know the truth. Rather, we should instead ask how we should respond. Consider the motives for disseminating this information at a particular time or place or to a particular group of people, and ask ourselves, what is the motive of the propagandist? And how does that affect the propagandist's credibility? I can hear you typing, Lisa. We should often choose not to respond the way the propagandist wants us to. So now is as good a time as any to turn to the Tara Reade allegations. And Lisa, you know what I'm going to say, so maybe you can help me out with this.
So I need to say right up front, I haven't been following this really closely. So I'm just going to back up and take a look at the facts and some of the things that we could probably all agree on. So she did work for Biden in 1993. At about the time the incident happened, she did mention it to some people that something inappropriate happened. The details of what happened seem to have shifted a bit over time, not sure to what extent. And the allegations are largely now coming out as a result of his probable nomination as the Democratic presidential candidate. So they didn't come out in a big way before, even when he was vice president or announced as vice president. So it's just kind of just a fact out there. And it's important to kind of look at facts, because facts are the building blocks of everything. And one of the big challenges in our current media system is that facts, opinions, beliefs, all of these things get twirled around and they're not the same. So a belief is not a fact, an opinion is not a fact. A fact is a fact. It's what is known. And it's important that we keep that in mind. And it's often good, I'll just call it like a fact set. So I just laid out 3 facts or 4 facts or however you want to count it. But it's important to keep the facts in mind, because as the video referenced, propaganda can still use facts to still mislead, in that they can selectively choose the facts and put together a story or a narrative around a situation, and they can do it in a way to obscure something else. And we actually have a word for it. It's that common, and we call that spin. So there's actually there can be a lack of veracity as far as some forms of propaganda, but you can actually have propaganda that is steeped in facts, but is constructed in such a way to manipulate. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Rich.
So we really want to support women who have been abused. And there are parts of this case that seem believable. There have been investigations that revealed nothing and new facts that seem to shed new light on the matter. The allegations are old, from when Biden was a senator 27 years ago. They're difficult to prove or defend against now. The issue should have been handled in a court of law a long time ago. So why these allegations, and why now? I mean, we really can't know whether the allegations are true or not, but we can question the motives for disseminating the information now. Propaganda is good or bad depending upon the intentions of the propagandist. Here we can be pretty sure of the intentions of those disseminating the Tara Reade allegations. The propagandists are trying to undermine the Democratic nominee in order to get Trump reelected. It is the eve of the election, and Biden has just secured the Democratic nomination for President of the United States. That's when the propagandists began to push this story, not before Biden secured the nomination, but immediately afterwards. If they were truly concerned about Biden becoming president, why did they wait until after the primary? The party could have simply turned to another candidate. We don't have to consider Tara Reade's credibility to understand the propagandist's intentions. Rather than asking who we believe, we should instead consider how to respond. If we continue to respond in ways the propagandist wants us to, we can expect to see more of these types of allegations against our candidates in the future. Ultimately, we cannot know what happened. Should we simply react emotionally in ways that cause us to act against our own interests? Propagandists want to turn us into their agents, and groups of people are easily manipulated. The propagandist uses group dynamics to manipulate us. He can cause us to fall into group think, where we stop thinking for ourselves and instead adopt the group's opinion. He needs only a minority of the group to react adversely, to cause division and factionalism. Women who are loyal to third parties or to feminism or to the Me Too movement will tend to believe Reed, whereas those loyal to the Democratic Party are likely to be more skeptical. We can't really know what happened 27 years ago, and loyalty is no basis for making determinations of fact. Our loyalties not only make us biased, they also make us vulnerable to manipulation. The propagandist targets our loyalties and emotions to override our critical thinking. When we react emotionally, or out of loyalty, or out of any of the logical fallacies propagandists use to manipulate us, we hand our power over to the propagandist and destroy ourselves both personally and politically. We become tools of the puppet master who targets our emotions and loyalties to make us act against our interests. Timing is a consideration. We must assume the effect that spreading certain information has on people is intentional. The effect combined with the timing should raise red flags even if we believe the information is true or correct. We should always consider the consequences of our actions. We must not say that we are so committed to our truth, loyalties, or beliefs that we must keep ourselves pure even if it destroys us and undermines our future. This is how propagandists get us to act against our own interest and in the interest of the propagandist. So Lisa, you have any comments? Are there any comments? You're muted, Lisa.
Luckily, they give you this big box that says you're muted too. So
Good.
Still takes a second to respond, but get there eventually. So I think as we look at the Trump, as we look at this Biden thing too, and I'm not telling anybody how to think, okay? I'm not, because I don't even know how I come out on the whole thing myself, because again, I haven't followed it super closely. But I would just say, consider this, and what I was explaining before when it comes to spin, and how facts can be pieced together in a way to hide or cover up something else. And I would just say, consider the fact that Trump is Biden's likely opponent. And it seems to me one possibility of what's happening here is a narrative has been constructed to make the comparison between Kavanaugh's accuser and Biden's accuser, and trying to make that comparison and the treatment of both. Now, Kavanaugh was up for a Supreme Court nomination, which is a lifetime appointment. It's a very different deal than president. President is a 4-year term, and it's a different situation. But you'll notice one other thing that they did by trying to frame this around Kavanaugh, the treatment of Kavanaugh's accusers versus Biden's accusers. And that's that they took Trump's and the many accusers that Trump has out of the mix. And there's quite a few. I don't know what the count is now, but it's quite a few. So they have purposely messaged around Trump. So the comparison of two presidential candidates and the accusations that have been raised around them are not what's in the public view. So I think it's important that we kind of look at it that way too, as a possibility. The other thing too is, if this is propaganda, which again, these messages and these comparisons with Biden, again, there is a truthfulness, as the video said. There's an element of truth in that which makes it compelling. But why would we compare the accusations against Kavanaugh to Biden and leave Trump completely out of the conversation? That's a key thing. Why are we not talking about Trump? Biden's not running against Kavanaugh. He's running against Trump. Let's look at that, because it looks like those will be our choices in November. And that's the importance, and that's the power of propaganda and narratives and how we look at situations. And that's what we need to at least consider. So it's just looking at things from different perspectives, looking at the narratives that are being put out there, understanding the intention. And this particular narrative would be one that's kind of like propaganda on steroids, because not only did they message around Trump, they managed to do it in such a way to split the left, and that's significant too. So I don't know. And going back one last point. So some people may say that the criteria should be the same for a Supreme Court justice as for Biden. Okay. But still, why are we not talking about Trump in this mix? Because Trump literally should be in this mix too if we're going to evaluate accusations and character. That's it. Thank you.
Well, yeah, and I got some questions here. Melinda, how is the Tara Reade? Is it that Tara Reade has not opened up the allegations against Trump? And I think you addressed that. Lisa, it should open the allegations against Trump.
Yeah.
And also, Bonita, you know, it is important to consider context and our values and the information we receive. So we're going to move on to his discussion about religion and politics. Notice how he described politics as similar to religion. What people once sought from the church, I can hear you type in, Lisa.
Sorry.
What people once sought from the church, they now seek from politics. This is because religion is a form of politics, and politics is a form of religion. Religion in its original form was politics. Theology was political ideology, priests were politicians, and kings were gods. Even today, the state is deified, and we often act as if our leaders are our saviors. Politics is a struggle over power and money, not ideas. Ideology, like theology, can be used to manipulate us. Brainwashing does and can happen, even over the internet. We are vulnerable because ideology, like theology, and the propaganda that comes with us give people meaning to hold on to defend, and to fight and die for. Now, what do you think about the idea that people are willing victims of propaganda? We use propaganda to support our opinions and act on our fears and prejudices. We seek out information that confirms our opinions and beliefs, and we love to hop on bandwagons with like-minded people. This is called confirmation bias. People use logic not to come to conclusions, but instead to support the beliefs and opinions they already hold. Additionally, we may even have innate or inborn tendencies towards certain types or ranges of political and religious opinions and beliefs. Do we have any comments, Lisa? You're muted again.
So just a couple things. There's a lot of really good comments about how all of us have some bias of some sort, because it is true. We are all limited by our experiences and education and everything else. And so that's very accurate. The key is what we're talking about here is being unconsciously or subconsciously influenced. So we all have our opinions based on our experiences and our beliefs and values and everything. But the key here is propaganda is manipulating and can manipulate basically our minds to have us believe and do things that we might not normally do that might be out of character, and that's why it's dangerous. For example, people would not normally go out and kill somebody else for the heck of it. They will, however, willingly in a war, for example. And so the Germans with the Nazis, for example, did all of those people just become horrible people overnight and then not? No, that was a result of propaganda and narratives that they believed. And so that's the key thing to look at it, the key thing to look at too. So we may not have agreement, we still may not be able to have the same conclusions based on our experiences, but the key is protecting yourself against these unconscious influences so that you cannot be manipulated into doing or being something that you are not, or is against your own interests. Hope that was
okay. That's good. So we're going to try this again. Now, none of these videos that I'm showing did I create. They're all videos I downloaded from the internet. So we're going to give this another shot here. Oh, boy. Yeah, all of that. Hold on a second. Okay. Here we go. How are we doing, Lisa?
Let's see. I can see the video.
You should be able to see my slide now.
Yes, I can see your.
Okay, great. Okay, so keep calm and carry on. Have you seen this before? What does it mean to you? The British government produced this poster in 1939 in preparation for World War II. The poster was intended to raise the morale of the British public if Germany invaded. They were never actually used, but can you imagine seeing this poster while Nazis launched their blitzkrieg and marched through the streets of England? Propaganda is the dissemination of information, facts, arguments, rumors, half-truths, or lies to influence public opinion. Dissemination is an essential component of propaganda. The timing of the dissemination and the intended audience give us information about the motives of the propagandist. Also notice that propagandists use facts and arguments as well as lies and half-truths. They love to use true facts and persuasive ideas to manipulate us. Propaganda is about causing us to think and act in ways that serve the propagandist. It's not about truth or falsehood or right or wrong or anything like that. Propaganda is everywhere. It's really very broad. Here are things that are propaganda: advertising, political messaging, publicity, public relations, entertainment, media, and news. Propaganda is a systematic effort to manipulate us by using symbols. Propaganda campaigns can be complex and widespread. They are designed and carried out at the highest levels, often using massive resources to get their message out. The United States government designed this poster to convince women to take war production jobs as part of their patriotic duty. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of women's ability to work that would come to represent women's equality and the right to work. Symbols are used to evoke an emotional response rather than an intellectual one. They can be powerful. Notice all the things that can be used as symbols: words, gestures, banners, monuments, music, clothing, insignia, hairstyle, designs on coins, postage stamps. Propaganda is a systematic effort to, all propaganda comes from the top. People think propaganda is some evil and nefarious material found only on extremist websites and social media, but it actually comes from large corporations, the media, governments, political parties, religious institutions, and other political and nonprofit organizations. Our trusted leaders use propaganda to motivate and manipulate us. I want to suggest that we really don't know the true motivations and objectives of our leaders. We don't know what goes on behind the scenes. We think they are trustworthy in doing the right thing, but do we really know? Who do they really serve? Themselves? Are they under the influence of corporations or foreign powers? This Uncle Sam poster was used to recruit soldiers for World War I and World War II. It has become an iconic image, and most Americans recognize Uncle Sam. Okay, so now I want to say something about Facebook. And social media. And some people are down on social media, but sites like Facebook and Twitter have made massive protests possible. The Arab Spring and the massive movements in Hong Kong and at other places have been aided by social media. Governments and corporations are trying to curtail their use for this. Unfortunately, social media can also be infiltrated and used against us. Social media is part of the propaganda problem, but it's the main media outlets that disseminate information broadly across the nation. Third-party propaganda sources spew out ideologically infused information also. While propaganda on social media is a problem, the partisan media is the biggest purveyor of propaganda. How can we enjoy the benefits of widespread communication networks and social media while securing them against infiltration and abuse? Social media is our speech. It's our opportunity to put ourselves out in the world. It's where regular people get to share and express themselves. Do we really want to return to a time when partisan media outlets act as gatekeepers over our speech? Are we falling for anti-Facebook propaganda? Whose interests are being served by setting people against Facebook and social media? So Lisa, if you have any comments, anything to add on that? You're muted.
I got to you before you said it. Thank you. A lot of discussion going on in chat. It's been, I think it's been good. A lot of topics that we're going to cover a little bit. We might not cover as fully. They could almost be their own webinar. We can back up and talk about that later, but it's an interesting discussion, a lot going on. So
Great.
Thanks
That's
to everybody
fantastic.
for your participation, and let's try to keep it nice with everybody. So try to stay nice and civil.
Okay.
As just a quick reminder.
Thank you, Lisa. Now we're back to the slides here. All right, so black or covert propaganda is propaganda where the source is intentionally hidden, like Russian propaganda that pretended to be American advocacy groups. White or overt propaganda is where the propagandist is known, such as the Uncle Sam poster disseminated by the United States. Gray propaganda is where the source is unclear or unknown. I find that white or overt propaganda is often disseminated to the right to rile them up, while black and gray propaganda is disseminated to the left to cause division and disarray among liberals and leftists. One of the main reasons the left has been unable to take and hold power is because we fall for propaganda every time, and we don't consider the source of the information and the motives of the propagandist. Cohesive propaganda can be used to rally people around the flag, for example, or whereas divisive propaganda is intended to cause disarray and promote factionalism. So let's talk about an example of divisive versus cohesive propaganda. Trump, for example, can get his base to rail against liberals by using overt propaganda that ridicules liberals. And this is also divisive propaganda. But propagandists spreading divisive propaganda to the left need to add the neo to the word liberal to get liberals to rail, or to get leftists to rail against liberals too. When you ask people to define neoliberal, they always describe something that sounds more like the Republican platform used to be. Then it describes the Democratic platform. The fact is, no one proclaims the mantle or title of neoliberal. The effect of using this language is to turn leftists against Democrats. We must assume that this effect is intended. The term also implies that the world is engaged in some sort of ideological struggle, that the central conflict in the world is between the ideology of capitalism and the ideology of socialism. This is not the central conflict, and we are not engaged in an ideological struggle. The powers of this world are engaged in a struggle over power and money. Ideology is merely a tool to manipulate people. The central political struggle in the world is between democracy and self-rule versus dictatorship. The conflict isn't about ideology. It's about who rules and how. The label neoliberal is vague and derogatory. It's name-calling, which we'll go over soon. And it doesn't really communicate anything other than perhaps not a socialist or not a progressive. To call someone a neoliberal is to presume we are engaged in a grand ideological struggle. It is a tool used to divide the left and cause us to lose elections with little or no concern for the adverse outcomes for the very people the propagandists claim to represent. They'll even lie outright and say it doesn't matter who wins. So now we've learned about Jacques Ellul and George Creel, and we've heard from Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky and quite a bit from Hitler. Now I want you to learn about someone else.
Edward Bernays persuaded women to smoke. He convinced the public that bacon and eggs were the true all-American breakfast. He also facilitated the successful overthrow of a democratically elected Guatemalan president. How did one man achieve these remarkable accomplishments? The methods he used to achieve these astonishing events are explained in his book, Propaganda. What is propaganda? Propaganda nowadays is seen as a synonym for lies. It implies half-truths, selective history, bias, misleading information and other tricks. However, it can be used in a positive manner. For example, a campaign to improve public health through vaccination. When used in such a constructive way, it can be a progressive force, capable of improving and benefiting every life and every home. Specific propaganda should be seen as good or bad depending on the merit of the cause urged and the correctness of the information published. Modern propaganda is a consistent and continuing effort to create or shape events to influence public relations on an enterprise, idea or group. Edward Bernays worked for the Woodrow Wilson administration in the First World War, using a propaganda model promoting America's war efforts as bringing democracy to Europe. After swaying the public across the world with this slogan, he set to work on employing propaganda in peacetime. Due to negative implications surrounding the word propaganda because of its use by the Germans in the war, he promoted the term public relations. Public relations expert is concerned with bringing an idea to the awareness of the public, using modern media communications and group formations of society. They act as an advisor to their clients. Edward Bernays had an impressive list of these clients, ranging from media companies such as Time Inc., CBS and NBC, through to individuals such as the President of the United States. He was not just a propagandist. He was concerned with courses of action, policies, systems and opinions, and the securing of public support for them. His responsibilities even included discovering new markets. The most famous new market Bernays was asked to uncover was that of women smoking cigarettes in the late 1920s. Up until then, women smoking in public was seen as a social taboo. Bernays set about removing this taboo to potentially double tobacco companies' possible clientele. First, he contacted a psychoanalyst to understand the societal perceptions that dissuaded women from smoking. He found that for feminists, cigarettes were like torches of freedom that symbolised their non-conformity and freedom from male oppression. He used this information to formulate a strategy and got a group of stylish women to march in an Easter Day parade. Prior to the parade, he had told the press that a group of women's rights marchers would light torches of freedom. On his cue, the women lit up their cigarettes in front of the eager photographers. The result was press coverage in several major newspapers, including the New York Times, which helped to break the taboo against women smoking in public. The study of mass psychology has brought to light the fact that a group can have certain mental characteristics distinct from that of an individual. Learning how the masses are influenced by various factors allows us to affect change in public opinion with a fair amount of accuracy. However, propaganda will never be an exact science, in the same way psychology or sociology isn't, because they deal with humans. If you can influence leaders, you automatically influence the groups they rule or have authority over. The group mind has impulses, emotions and habits, rather than thoughts as such. It makes up its mind by impulsively following the example of a trusted leader or authority figure. If this is not available, the herd thinks by cliches or images that stand for a group of experiences or ideas. An old propagandist would treat the human mind as an individual machine and rely on certain stimulus, often repeated, creating a habit. Similarly, they would reiterate an idea to create conviction with individuals. For example, to advertise bacon and eggs, adverts would contain phrases along the lines of "Eat more eggs," "Bacon is good for you," and "Bacon and eggs are cheap and healthy." A new propagandist such as Bernays, who understands group psychology, would first look at who influences eating habits. The answer is doctors and physicians. They would then suggest to these doctors and physicians to publicly state that eating bacon and eggs is good for you. The propagandist knows that a large number of people will follow the advice of their doctor due to the psychological relationship between a person and their doctor. A doctor signifies health, which in turn signifies long life. Bernays used these exact methods of leader influence to convince the public that bacon and eggs were the true all-American breakfast. Bernays sold more bacon, not by telling Americans that bacon is tasty, but by asking doctors the question, is it more healthy to eat a hearty breakfast or a skimpy breakfast? His advertisements then said, 9 out of 10 doctors recommend a hearty breakfast like this one, with a photo of bacon and eggs. An old advertiser would try to persuade an individual to buy an item immediately. For example, buy this piano, now! Using reiteration and emphasis directed upon the individual, the advertiser tries to break down sales resistance. A new advertiser would, instead of directly penetrating sales resistance, try to remove it by creating circumstances that will swing emotional currents that will build purchaser demand. For example, a new advertiser, when selling a piano, would try to develop acceptance of the idea of a music room in the house, perhaps by arranging an exhibition of music rooms by well-known designers, inviting key people of influence with regards to buying habits, i.e. famous musicians. The music room will be accepted, and people with a music room will naturally think of buying a piano, believing it comes as their own idea. Instead of saying to the purchaser, "Please buy a piano," they have caused the purchaser to say, "Please sell me a piano." All these methods and techniques were used for Bernays' most extreme propaganda campaign, the overthrow of the Guatemalan government. The government had introduced labour laws that allowed workers to strike if their demand for higher wages were not met. The United Fruit Company had been the largest landowner and employer in Guatemala for several years, and these laws would affect their profits. Edward Bernays was hired by the United Fruit Company to persuade Americans that the then Guatemalan president, Jacobo Arbenz, was a communist, when in reality he was a liberal capitalist. Bernays ran an intensive campaign of misinformation to portray the company as the victim of the government for several years, including taking American journalists to Guatemala and arranging for them to interview only those who opposed Arbenz. Bernays' involvement led to US President Eisenhower to intervene, and ultimately Arbenz was overthrown in a US-sponsored coup designed to make the world safe for large US corporations.
Okay, so bacon and eggs. How many of us have imprinted in our minds the image of bacon and eggs as that healthy breakfast Americans eat? We are still told to eat a healthy breakfast. Come to find out, it was all just a corporate trick to get us to start eating first thing in the morning. We have an obesity epidemic in part because of Edward Bernays. Then tricking women into smoking and making it seem like a feminist and empowering thing to do, when in reality, it was the exact opposite. Isn't that just typical of propaganda, to make us believe we are being liberated, when in reality, we are being manipulated? We are still manipulated in this way today into thinking we are being true progressives by believing and behaving in certain ways, when in reality, we are contributing to the division and factionalism that destroys us. Overthrowing a democratically elected nation shows the power of propaganda. There was an elaborate and complex strategy in Guatemala. It was a consistent and continuous effort, a systematic effort to get the United States to do the bidding of the United Fruit Company. And it did so with complete disregard for democracy or the will of the Guatemalan people. Oops. Okay, now this is the type of propaganda you were expecting, extremist propaganda. The group that created this poster had selectively edited President Obama's words, combining clips from two different parts of his speech in a way that completely changed the meaning of what he said. That's where we get the New World Order from. They are also the ones who tried to portray Obama as Hitler. And do you remember that? And recently I saw some right-wing activists, a picture of right-wing activists portraying Biden as Hitler on a banner a few weeks ago. You know, one would think that that would make them their hero, you know, make him their hero. So propaganda appeals to our emotions in order to bypass our critical thinking and skepticism. We are emotional beings more than we are intellectual. We must avoid emotional rushes to judgment, because once we make a commitment to a position, it's difficult for us human beings to change. Even intelligent people can be deceived, even in cults. Professors and academics are just as subject to clicks and fads as anyone else, and they sometimes don't understand or care about how they can be used by publishers and the media to promote division and disinformation. Propaganda appeals to our already held beliefs, opinions, sentiments, and prejudices. We see this with overt propaganda that either blatantly or by dog whistle appeals to people's prejudices and fears. But we often fail to recognize the more subtle, covert propaganda that appeals to our opinions, beliefs, and sentiments. Our identities and allegiances can be used to inflame our passions and misdirect our actions. We know that divisive propaganda will be used to divide the nation and to divide the left in order to undermine democracy. Persuasive ideas and true facts can be disseminated in a way that promotes disunion and disaffection at a time when solidarity is most needed, such as during an election. It's important to be skeptical of political scandal and divisive ideological debates that lead to demoralization and defections at the height of an election. We must question the motives of the propagandist. What is he trying to make us think and do? We use shortcuts to conserve our cognitive resources. Today and in this age, we are overwhelmed with information. So we cut corners by looking to authority figures and those we identify with for guidance. And this sometimes serves us, but it also makes us vulnerable to being misled by unscrupulous leaders and deceptive covert messaging. Propaganda can be divisive, particularly around issues of race, religion, and ideologies. In my experience, propagandists use hot-button topics to stoke hatred and sow division. I'm skeptical of any approach that separates out or treats people differently because of their ability, identity, or some other characteristic. Much of the factionalism around these issues are the result of ideas turned into weapons and used against us. You may remember when pictures suddenly appeared of Governor of Virginia Ralph Northam in blackface. At that time, we knew the photograph had been disseminated by a far right-wing group. But the image inflamed liberal media and caused leaders of the Democratic Party to call for the Democratic governor of Virginia to step down. That was until they realized that the top 3 Democrats in Virginia were in trouble due to what was an organized and systematic attack. Thankfully, the black voters of Virginia were not fooled. This left the pundits dismayed, but the black voters in Virginia know Governor Northam. They were not about to allow accusations from far-right media sources, even if true, to undermine Democratic rule in Virginia. They considered the source of the information and understood the intent of the propagandists to undermine Democratic leadership in Virginia. They were not about to let that happen. Propagandists take advantage of our desire to belong, our naivete, or willingness to trust people, or our situation or other vulnerability. It's important to recognize that propagandists seek to influence the behavior and attitudes of groups of people. They appeal to our social needs and desires and prey on human weakness and gullibility. I also want to warn you about the use of covert mind control techniques. I recently ran into one of the groups I struggled with in college. They are now called Refuse Fascism, and I feel I need to tell people about it so we can protect ourselves. The group happened to be working on the same issue I was, impeachment, and they let me speak at their rallies, and I used my speeches to teach and inspire them. I knew their materials were propaganda. I let them know I disagreed with them on certain things. At the last meeting I attended, I was arguing with a longtime leader of the group, and she was smiling at me and touching me and holding my hand, which was surprising given we were arguing. I thought she might be flirting with me. Then suddenly, I found myself asleep. I felt fatigued and I couldn't open my eyes. I thought to myself, oh bleep, she just hypnotized me. I couldn't hear what she was saying and I couldn't open my eyes. So I asked myself what the issue or question was. What was she telling me or trying to make me think or do? I faintly felt that the question was whether I was seeing things right, whether I was understanding things. Then I exclaimed, I think out loud, I can see reality, and I awoke and didn't feel tired at all. I want to warn you about covert hypnosis and political cults. There are techniques that people use in forms of undue influence and coercion that organizations and groups use to manipulate their members. There are not just religious cults, there are political cults, business cults, self-improvement cults. I encourage you to research these things yourself to protect yourself and your family. Now, Lisa, let's go here. You have a certification in NLP and in hypnosis. What can you tell us about these things?
So I got into NLP specifically because I had heard that NLP is used a lot in political speeches, and I was curious. So I started to want to figure out and learn a little bit more about it. And what I ended up walking into was a series of training classes that were more for personal development. And while it wasn't necessarily exactly what I was looking for, it kind of was, because what we went through were a lot of training exercises, so that not only, like in the case of hypnosis, not only did we hypnotize people in the class, we were hypnotized. and along with a lot of the NLP, neuro-linguistics programming is what it stands for. So neuro-linguistics programming. And so there's a lot of NLP exercises that we went through. And what I learned, even though again, it wasn't my intent, what I learned was the strength and the power of this. And the situation is set up because we are taking in millions and millions and millions of bytes of information a second. The numbers vary, but it's just a massive amount. We can only be conscious of the sliverest of slivers of so many bytes of information a second. I think it's like 7 plus or minus 2 bytes, but we're taking in millions. Now, and that's the key, because what happens is that provides the opportunity kind of for our minds to get hacked. If something doesn't attract our attention, if we don't notice something, it can kind of slip through the back door. And hacking is probably the best way to explain it. And that's kind of what we're talking about with propaganda. It's deliberately using mind hacks, basically, to influence people's thinking in ways that they don't consciously understand. So I think it's really important, and it's really significant, and I would hope that more people would learn more about it. And when I say that, though, there's a super, super big asterisk. When you start looking into hypnosis, NLP, or anything like this, you want to learn from credible organizations, because this stuff is so powerful. And I happen to learn from a group of people who if anybody even acts shady about using this for shady purposes, they'll just walk away from them. They don't want students like that. They don't want to teach people like that. And so you really want to find people who are ethical, who are honest, and who are doing the right thing with this, because it can be very dangerous if you're around people who don't. So I think that's it. If you have questions, go ahead and put it in chat. But I was just saying, the whole key thing is the power of it is, it's like our brains get tangled up, and what NLP can do is kind of untangle things. So that's the power. Propaganda can also tangle up your mind, though, too, subconsciously, and cause a lot of problems. So it's all subconscious, like Rich said at the beginning. It's all unconscious or subconscious. We're not aware of it, and we're very convinced that it's our own thinking. And that's the power of propaganda and what we're talking about.
Yeah, we had a number of people who raised their hands, and I accidentally lowered them. If you want to raise your hand, and near the end, you might be able to get pull some of you guys into the program. So we're going to continue on, though, with the next slides, and then we'll have a discussion at the end. All right. All right. So there are tons of logical fallacies, and you can look them up. The point, Lisa, I can hear you typing now. The point is that there's always something incomplete and one-sided about propaganda. We don't need to learn about all the logical fallacies. We just need to be critical and skeptical about what we choose to think and believe. Yeah, and some of these logical fallacies, Lisa was telling me, is that they appear logical, but they're really unsound. And so we're going to go over some types of propaganda now, the basic types. Card stacking. I use card stacking as an attorney all the time. I want to talk about the strong parts of my case, but I don't want to talk about the weaknesses. Testimony is like an endorsement, and we see that all the time in politics. Glittering generalities or short phrases that by themselves mean nothing, but people make up their own meaning, like keep calm and carry on, or we can do it. Plain folks, just a normal guy like Joe the plumber. Remember Joe the plumber? The McCain-Palin campaign gave him that moniker and brought him to speak at campaign rallies. Bandwagon, come on, get on board. Everyone's doing it. and name calling. We should be able to recognize name calling when we hear it. When one candidate calls his opponent a bigot or racist or something like that, he may be right, but we should recognize it for what it is, name calling. But rather than me giving you a bunch of examples, I'll just show you a short video. And this video I'm going to need to do some narration in it because there's no sound. There's sound, but no, to help the people who are listening. So here we go. Oops, that was the wrong way to go. Name calling.
We have seen their kind before. They are the heirs of all the murderous ideologies of the 20th century. By sacrificing human life to serve their radical visions, by abandoning every value except the will to power, they follow in the path of fascism, Nazism, and totalitarianism. And they will follow that path all the way to where it ends, in history's unmarked grave of discarded lies.
Glittering generalities.
Across Texas, every major newspaper endorses Barack Obama, praising his unifying vision, consistent judgment, and wise foreign policy. Obama is about solutions, not divisions. On health care, he proposes a system that's affordable for everyone. Obama's smart and experienced, the best qualified by skill and temperament.
Transfer. Images of politicians in front of flags. Testimonial.
You're seeing now Mitt Romney in Massachusetts expected now to endorse John McCain, his former rival. Let's listen.
Things can get pretty rough in a political campaign. And in the thick of the fight, it's easy to lose sight of your opponent's finer qualities. But the truth of the matter is that in the case of Senator McCain, I could never quite do that. Even when the contest was close and our disagreements were debated, the caliber of the man was apparent. And this is a man capable of leading our country at a dangerous hour. Senator McCain understands the war we're in, the necessity of victory, and the consequences of surrender. For him, national security is not just another agenda item. It is the abiding concern and responsibility of the nation. This is a man who tied his political fortunes to the fortunes of our country at a time of war. Such courage is not always rewarded in politics, but it was this time, and that's a credit both to the man and to the party he will lead in the election of 2008.
Plain folks.
I may be an underdog in this campaign, running against two candidates with $200 million between them. But the real underdogs are the middle class and the voiceless in this country, losing ground while CEOs pocket million-dollar bonuses and corporate lobbyists get their way in Washington. ExxonMobil rakes in record profits, gets government handouts, and gas prices go through the roof. At the same time, 200,000 veterans, men and women who wore America's uniform, will sleep tonight under bridges and on graves. We cannot simply replace a bunch of corporate Republicans with a bunch of corporate Democrats. I've never taken a dime from Washington lobbyists or PACs. I know who the underdogs are in this fight. I know that the fight to save the middle class will be an epic battle, and I will never give up. We're going to take the fight to save the middle class all the way to the convention and the White House. We're going to look our children in the eye and tell them, we left you a better life than we had.
Card stacking.
Our National Security Department, he says there is no evidence. It's no different than it was in 2003. You know what I really fear about what's happening here? It's another Iraq coming. There's war propaganda going on. And And we're arguing, to me, the greatest danger is that we will have a president that will overreact, that we will soon bomb Iran.
You need an independent flow of information that you can trust, that has some accuracy, something other than simply government information. You need a historical and political context into which to put that information, because random facts mean nothing to most people without some framework. And finally, you need the widest range of opinion that's circulating in the culture so that people have, in a sense, something to rub up against, somewhere to test their own ideas. And on all three of those things, I think the American media has failed, and I think failed miserably this time around.
Bandwagon.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
It looks like Michael Maxenti is up first. There's a button that says allow to talk. So I'm going to push that and we're going to see what happens. So there you are, Michael. So if you would unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask your question or make your comment.
Hi, Rich and Lisa. My analogy, to rise above the propaganda and our biases, is very difficult for people to understand because, and that's where I mentioned earlier, there's a great source that I recommend to everybody to help you broaden your thinking and get a broader perspective. And that's called allsides.com. It was founded by one of the original Yahoo founders. And its whole purpose is to allow people to quickly and easily see exactly what, from the original source, what 5 different media, one from the hard left, soft left, centrist, soft right, hard right, are saying at any given time about any given subject, the main news story. Then you can begin to draw a comparison and think for yourself what might be the truth or what you're comfortable with. And the analogy I like to give to people is all of us have been watching a sporting event. Your team gets a call by the umpire or the referee that goes against you. Everybody's upset. Everybody's mad. The first 2 instant replays confirm that umpire blew that call. It's costing my team. Sometimes you get to the 3rd and 4th, 5th camera, and it's still convincing. He was dead out. The umpire blew it. Now you get out there to that left field camera, and oh my goodness, the guy did miss the tag by 2 inches, and everybody, if they'd have stopped at the 1st or 2nd or 3rd camera angle, still would have been confirmed. The umpire blew it. So you have to rise above the high enough and get a broad enough perspective before you can really discern what the truth is. And that's why it's so important to go to a site like All Sides. They have a great drop-down window with media guide on media bias, to help people understand the sophistication of it. And if you sign into it, they'll give you a simple little survey to help confirm your bias. Now, once you've confirmed where your bias is, which everybody will pretty much know, then they'll send you, based on what your bias is, another set of headlines and subheads and ask you to identify what you think the source's intentions were. And you'll be amazed. I was in media for 40 years. I thought I had a good understanding of my own bias. Once I took that survey to the second one, oh my God, my bias was influencing me far more than I ever thought. And I was very surprised how my own inability to see beyond that bias to what the truth of the intentions of that headline were. So leave it at that.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. Very good. And drop that link in chat so that we make sure that we all get it.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay. Tom Eggebein, I'm going to allow you to talk.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Anyway, Rich, good to see you again. Lisa, good to meet you for the very first time. My thanks. As I was listening earlier to the question about bias, that's an interesting little word, and it can be used in such malleable ways. the ultimate expression is like everybody has a bias, which is sort of like saying all lives matter. Yes, everybody has a bias. I just got done reading a couple of weeks ago a biography on Lincoln, and I thought of the Lincoln-Douglas debates as you all were talking. Lincoln had a bias. Douglas had a bias. Lincoln's bias was simply that ultimately, as it evolved in his life, slavery was not only wrong and inefficient, it was evil. Douglas, on the other hand, thought that slavery was of economic necessity. It was good for the growers in the South who had the longer growing season, the hotter weather. You needed cheap labor to harvest cotton and make it a profitable deal. Everybody's got a bias. And as I read the biography and I was listening here today, the question is, how do we evaluate our bias? We have to begin by saying, well, what's my bias? And I think one of the key pieces between Lincoln and Douglas is Lincoln understood equality, all created equal, in a very inclusive way. Douglas defined it essentially as meaning propertied white men. I think the difference between inclusion or exclusion, how wide is the circle or how tiny the circle, and these days, like with the protesters in Michigan, a sense that somehow or another my freedom is curtailed by others and their freedoms. Some have the freedom to avoid contamination. Well, that fear gets in the way of my freedom to not wear a mask and do whatever the heck I want. So I think there are some fundamental tests that we can apply in terms of how we evaluate what our bias is. Anyway,
Awesome.
Thanks for this, guys. Terrific.
Thank you. All right, thank you. And go ahead.
Just one quick thought, if I could. I think we're done with hand raisers. Oh, no, we're not. Go ahead and go with the hand raisers. Sorry. I want everybody a chance to speak.
All right.
Melinda?
So, yes. So Melinda, I'm going to allow you to talk. Okay. And I'm going to try.
Are you ready?
Okay. Is there any way that you can actually see the chat as this is going on? Because there's a lot of examples of what you're talking about. And it's a little overwhelming, you know what I mean? It reminds me of just a wave of information that, you know, is put out, and, you know, it gets proven one way or another, but there's just so much coming at you that you can't really deal with it all. You know what I mean? And, you know, people say, oh no, this is a fact. Here's my source. This proves it. And it's like, you know, the people in the chat aren't even listening to the presentation. You know, they're just here to say their piece, you know, and I got sucked into it because I don't like to just let things be said without any opposition. You know, so it's like, how do you deal with, you know, especially during these last few years with the amount of stuff that's coming at you?
Yeah. Well, one thing is that when I'm doing the presentation, I cannot see the chat. So I'm blind as far as that goes when I'm in screen share mode. So we've got an exercise to do, and we've got two more hands raised. Thank you, Melinda. And let's go, Bonita. I know you've been up a couple times. Here you go. So go ahead and unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes. We can hear you now.
Yes, thank you for this discussion, much needed. I am finding it extremely difficult, increasingly difficult to engage and actually have productive discussions, even with family members and neighbors who I generally like as real people. But when you get into anything, and everything can be considered political nowadays. If I say it's a lovely day, I had a neighbor, now we were suffering from some terrible red tide here in Florida last year, for example, and my neighbor, who was an immigrant next door, had a visiting relative who was staying at the beach. And I simply, I know not to talk politics with him, but I simply said, I'm sorry, the beach is in bad shape right now. And he very quickly offered me the information that the reason we had the red tide, it was all the Muslims' fault. It's the GD Muslims that caused it, and I tried to change the subject, and so it's ridiculous. And then I have family members, my own brother, who's an extremely intelligent guy I grew up with. Everything's about politics, everything's about his civil liberties, and don't tell him to wear a mask, or they know you're invading his freedom to do these things. And so I think, you know, it's very difficult for us to engage in a productive discussion with people when we don't have any solid base. I mean, you can't say, do you believe in the Constitution? Because a lot of them really don't. You know, I went to that Broadway show before Broadway shut down about what the Constitution means to me. Yeah, I mean, do you believe in the Constitution? You believe in we have rights? And, you know, what part of this do we disagree with? That, you know, it's not like we just don't agree on religion, but people are a cousin that I grew up with of the same religion. We believe in our families, but somehow or other politically they draw the line. And so I don't know, they're saying now Snopes is not reliable. Okay, I look up something on Snopes and says Snopes says this is false. Or I look something up on democracy and there's always some argument, because as I loved your confirmation bias quote that you call things confirmation bias. They're not looking for facts, they're looking for support of their preconceived notions. And the fact that you disagree with them gives them more fuel. I mean, it's kind of like, oh, you know what? He did these things, but he was sent by God to take care of us. You know, oh my God. You know, and so I'm having a, I don't know, I'm looking for the answers here, and I appreciate what you've shared, but it's like you're preaching to the choir sometimes. And I don't think this is a leftist discussion. I've seen some comments in the chat saying that people thought this was a leftist discussion, but it shouldn't be a leftist discussion. I do a lot of work with the pro-climate movements and a lot of kids that are trying to do it. It shouldn't be, but yet here we are. What do we have in common nowadays? Not much.
Right. Thank you, Bonita. And you know, I think some of that is leftist propaganda. Third-party propaganda is trying to get us to lose faith in our institutions, and so that they can destroy our democracy. So this is coming from foreign countries, and that's why we see people who don't understand the Constitution, don't value it, and don't even want to fight for it, which is what we did with the impeachment thing. We got one more. Cheryl?
Oh, could I respond to Bonita real quick?
Yeah, because we're running late.
Yeah, I understand. I'm sorry. This will be fast. So, Bonita, I worked on a documentary called Brainwashing of My Dad, or The Brainwashing of My Dad. And it kind of goes through how the media affected her father. And it might show you how it's affected, you know, what's kind of happened in your family. So, and the power of media on her dad specifically, because it's a full story. So you might want to check into that. I don't, disclosure, I was just a media consultant. I make no money if you watch it. It's just, it fits with your situation.
Okay, Cheryl, if you want to mute yourself.
Yes, hi. It's not so much a question as, or it is. I'm not fully understanding your point about we are emotional beings, so we must avoid rushing to judgment, because once we make a critical judgment, it can be difficult to make a change. And I thought, really? Is it really hard to make a change? And I guess I'm trying to get that one down, and a couple others, if I can toss them in. Right. You know, like, what does that mean? Is that true? And then if an enemy points out a truth, and I had to use the word enemy, I was typing fast. Okay. Is it always bad? Because we were talking about when sometimes the opposition points out a bunch of facts that might bother, that we have to look at about the blackface. We have to look at the point, why was it being brought up? But is it always bad when the opposition's bringing up some things that we need to examine? Or, you know, do we just abandon it? And isn't it possible to lead ourselves down? I think you just talked about this question. I'll leave it be. Okay.
So basically, yes, it is hard for us to change. Actually, they found as a lawyer, if you start arguing a case, you may not believe it when you started it, but by the end, you suddenly have a position. And it's very hard for us to actually change, because we spend most of our time defending our position. Or, like we said, we use reason and logic not to come to conclusions, but to argue and support the positions we already have, which we may have an innate tendency towards, or we may already have a bias towards that, so, or whatever, but it's really hard for people to change once they hold a position, to admit they may have been wrong. And then as far as this being a leftist, it's a nonpartisan, but we're dealing with the left. So we're dealing with the propaganda that is dividing the left. And so what that means is that we're going to confront it. And so it is leftist, but it is a left on the left side. But I said it was nonpartisan because we do a lot of general education, and then we're hoping that conservatives will see us dealing with the propaganda.
I was more thinking about when the blackface incident came up and they realized it was being an attack from the right, that they had to kind of abandon the whole thing and just support him. And I'm okay with that, but I'm just like trying to recognize too that you do have to examine the truth if the truth is brought to you by the opposition. Yeah,
but well, let's thank you, Cheryl, and let's move to the next topic. And so I want to quickly point out, and we're going to have to do this pretty quickly, the characteristics of healthy and unhealthy organizations. So this is a slide by Steve Hassan, who is an expert on cults and mind control. And we can see here that constructive and healthy organizations, individuals, and leaders are authentic, they have unconditional love, conscience, creativity, humor, free will, critical thinking, they're psychologically healthy, know their own limits, they're empower individuals, they're trustworthy, accountable, they have checks and balances, people know what they're getting into, there's room for diversity and individuality, the means is just as important as the ends, if not more important, and it encourages growth. And if people leave there, it's not a big deal. But on unhealthy or destructive or authoritarian, there's a cult identity, love is conditional, there's a focus on doctrine, there's fear and guilt, dependency, obedience. The leaders are often narcissistic, psychopathic, elitist, grandiose, they're power hungry, secretive, deceptive, they claim absolute authority, and the organization structure is authoritarian. People are deceptive and manipulative, clones people, the ends justify the means for them, and it preserves their own power, and if anybody leaves, they had no legitimate reason. So I just wanted to point that out, that these are some things to look for when we're in groups or with individuals. And I'd like to move on to our exercise here, and you can respond in the chat here. So, and if we have time, we'll bring some people up, but I don't think we will. But so this Pew study here says that nearly half of voters think that Christian nationalism is a threat in the next 10 years to the vital interest of the country. And we can see among all registered voters, 20% think it's a critical threat and 27% think it's important but not critical. So that's a full 47% of the population who thinks that Christian nationalism is a threat. And then if we come to Democrats, see that's a full 63% who think that Christian nationalism is a threat. And so there's been a Pew, this is because there's a study that found that 17% of Americans are religious resistors. They believe that religion is a cause of much evil and violence in the world, especially Christianity. And most of these people are liberals and are leftists, even though there are some far-right Islamophobes, atheist Islamophobes. So my question to you is, what would the propagandists see here? And I'm wondering if we've got any answers to that in the chat, Lisa. So, and so what I would say is that what the propagandist sees here is opportunity. To the propagandists, this is a fear that can be exploited. So how can the propagandists use this knowledge to manipulate us? Are we getting any answers in the chat, Lisa?
Shows how labels are deceptive too. Christian nationalism is an oxymoron if you think about it and dig deeper. The truth is from one's own perspective. That's why it's so important to gain a broader perspective. Somebody else said close down churches. Those are the comments so far.
Okay, so we need to move beyond the truth and falsehood of our claim or allegation and look to the motives of the propagandist. We often want to think that the propagandist has good motives and wants to warn us of a dire and impending threat to our freedom and well-being, but the propagandist motives may be quite different. So what types of sentiments do the propagandists appeal to here? Is it fear, prejudice, anger, ignorance? Do you have any answers in the chat? I'll go on to the next while we collect some answers to that. And then what types of attitudes would the propagandists try to evoke? How could they use this to provoke division and factionalism on the left, as well as broader division across the nation? So when we make the election about Christianity, we lose, of course. If Bernie Sanders had won the nomination, I would be warning people right now not to make the election about Christianity, because this is the propaganda they plan to use to divide the nation. Had Bernie won the nomination, they would have caused division and conflict by pitting Christian-hating socialists against Christian nationalists. And once the election becomes about Christianity, rather than what it really is about, which is about whether Trump should get another term, anytime it deviates from that question, it's helping Trump. Do you have any answers, Lisa? Any comments?
Yes. Okay. So I've got fear, prejudice, etc. are all strong emotions that they appeal to. Fear is the great motivator, the idea that there is not enough, so appeal to scarcity. Let's see. There's a propagandist report to negative emotions, fear and greed.
Awesome.
Are there examples of propaganda appealing to better senses?
Yes. In fact, there's good propaganda. Propaganda used to boost the morale, like the Carry On propaganda, or even the We Can Do It propaganda. There's positive uses of propaganda, and as we've said, positive uses, that you determine it by the intention of the propagandist. Now,
And
what type? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and the idea of being supportive, truly supportive, like the Carry On and sort of thing, and those narratives in which people try to unite, as long as that attempt to unite doesn't become coercive, because sometimes it can be used coercively, and like you said, it depends on the intent.
Right. So what types of behaviors would the propagandists be trying to elicit here? How could they use this information to affect our relationships and how we act towards one another? So, and then the next question while we're gathering that one is Christian nationalism really a threat? And I'm going to give my opinion, of course. Christian nationalism is not new. Fundamentalism, the theology upon which much of Christian nationalism is said to be based, is actually an apolitical theology. Fundamentalism was a reaction against the social gospel of the early 20th century, as well as against modernism. It focused on personal salvation and eschewed political involvement. Again, this approach here tries to present the issue as a theological or ideological struggle, but we're not engaged in a theological struggle unless we make it a theological struggle. To the threat of Christian nationalism. So, and then one thing to remember is that this, and like I said, it's not about Christianity. So, and we're still seeing other groups out there spreading this, using this trope here. This election is not about Christianity, it's about what's best for this country. There's no mass movement calling themselves Christian nationalists. As I was telling Lisa last night, I can see Christian nationalism as a construct, but I can't see it as a particular group of people that's identifiable. And so there's no mass movement calling themselves Christian nationalists. Let's not create one. So Lisa, what have we got? And I see we got a question too. Okay, so the answer, so I've got a question from Bonita, and there's actually a video on the cult of Trump, and you can go to Steve Hassan's page. We need to treat them with respect, and sort of like the Trump supporters. Where were they before Trump? What were they like before Trump? If you get them to move back to what they were like before they got all crazy about Trump. And so telling them they're cold or they're wrong is not going to work. You have, Lisa, I'm going to pull this down now. Any questions, any comments in the chat?
Let's see. There's about power and control. Some of them are, this isn't just about Trump, it's about power and control. So there's a lot of, some people talking about the idea of the larger issue of power and control versus political parties. And we have to start looking at the media we consume as almost like food. You don't put in junk, you don't eat junk food, you don't eat junk media. And you have to be careful about it that way because it does impact us. And as a society, we haven't really caught up with that. We accepted the Industrial Revolution advantages and got pollution and disease, more disease, right? So we accepted this whole media revolution, and now we've got kind of sick minds. And we have to kind of figure out how to get everything back, you know, kind of get course corrected. And I'm not saying Jade has a sick mind, just saying because we all are affected by this. You know, we're all breathing in the same toxic media or the same toxic air. So it's affecting us all.
Jacques Zalo said, it's a threat to the total personality. People's personality change. They go berserko. Okay, so I want to keep in touch with everyone. Keep a lookout for emails from me about other events and actions. You can find me on Facebook. Google my author page at laprogressive.com and check out my podcast, Bible Study for Progressives. It's a show where moderates, liberals, and leftists of all faiths and ideologies come together to discuss scripture, spirituality, and politics. The shows range from intense biblical studies to pure politics, especially during the election. And so I didn't put any links in there, but you can find me. And I hope this webinar has been helpful. And if it has, please spread the word about what you've learned. And if you want us to do a training or speak to your group, just let us know. And I'll put my email in the chat before we go too. And so that's about it. Thank you everybody for coming and for participating and for staying with us through this 2-hour program. It looks like we've ended on time. I'm putting my email. You can save the chat by there's in the bottom corner, there's 3 dots. And so you can save the chat, and that way you won't lose any of the information.
Thank you again for all your participation, your questions, and all your comments too. I think it added a lot of value, and we do appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Very good job, everybody. Rhett, thank you. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you, all of you. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Lasky. Thank you, everybody. Bye now.